They blocked my cabin driveway. Over a $69 fine. Not kidding. There was an actual metal barrier with a sign accusing my car of violating resort aesthetics. My cabin's been here longer than most of these people's mortgages. But suddenly, my Honda Civic is a threat to civilization? The HOA calls it maintaining standards. I call it petty tyranny on a gravel road. And the woman behind it all? Let's just say Deborah Langley isn't done yet. You won't believe how far this goes. Ever been fined just for existing? Comment below if your HOA's ever gone completely off the rails. This one's a ride. The whole situation felt surreal. Here I was, coming home to the place I'd called home for 10 years, and suddenly I'm being treated like some unwanted intruder. The fine was for driving a 2015 Honda Civic that apparently doesn't meet the standards of a high-end resort community. I'd never heard of such a standard before, and I'd been part of this community since the beginning. Deborah appeared out of nowhere, explaining this was a new regulation from the Elkhorn Ridge HOA. The way she said it, with such authority and disdain, immediately put me on edge. Let me paint you the picture of what we're dealing with here. I bought this wooden cabin 10 years ago, when Elkhorn Ridge was just a quiet collection of homes around a beautiful lake. I was one of the first residents, back when neighbors knew each other's names and helped each other out. The HOA was only established 1 year ago, after the area started developing into a tourist destination and wealthy folks began moving in. That's when people like Deborah showed up, wanting to transform our peaceful community into some kind of exclusive resort. My simple one-story wooden cabin stood in stark contrast to Deborah's massive 2-story palace that screamed money and status. "Do you understand this is a resort community?" Deborah continued, her voice dripping with condescension. "Your old cabin and that beat-up car are bringing down everyone else's property values. Times have changed, and you need to keep up or find somewhere else to live." I tried to explain calmly that I'd been living here for a decade, long before any of these so-called standards existed. But she cut me off with a wave of her manicured hand, like I was some annoying insect buzzing around her perfectly styled blonde hair. The sheer arrogance of this woman was breathtaking. Here she was, someone who just moved to our community, trying to dictate how those of us who'd been here for years should live our lives. What struck me most was how quickly the atmosphere of our once peaceful community had changed. The cabin I'd grown to love, with its rustic charm and lakefront view, was now being treated like an eyesore. My reliable Honda Civic, which had served me faithfully through countless commutes to the police station, was suddenly deemed unworthy of our neighborhood. The irony wasn't lost on me that someone whose job it was to uphold the law was being harassed by someone who clearly thought rules only applied to other people. But I decided to take the high road, at least for now. Instead of flashing my badge and putting an end to this nonsense immediately, I chose to see how this would play out. As Deborah climbed back into her pristine BMW, she rolled down the window for one final shot. "I hope you understand that this is just the beginning," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We have standards to maintain here, and if you can't meet them, well..." She let the threat hang in the air as she drove away, leaving me standing there with a $69 fine and a growing sense that this woman had seriously underestimated who she was dealing with. The peaceful sound of Lake Foxglass lapping against the shore seemed almost mocking now, a reminder of how quickly paradise can turn into a battleground. Standing on my cabin's wooden porch, I held that $69 fine and watched Deborah's BMW disappear around the curve. 10 years of peaceful living in this place had just come to an end. She had no idea that I'd just decided to look very carefully into these new regulations of hers. And with my years of experience in law enforcement, I knew exactly where to start digging. What Deborah Langley didn't realize was that she'd just picked a fight with someone who specialized in getting to the truth, someone who understood better than most that bullies like her only got away with their behavior when good people stayed quiet. The lake reflected the evening sun as I walked into my cabin, already formulating a plan. This wasn't just about a $69 fine anymore. This was about protecting a community I'd grown to love from someone who saw it as nothing more than a business opportunity. Deborah thought she'd found an easy target in the quiet guy with the old car and simple cabin. What she didn't know was that quiet people often see and hear more than anyone realizes. And sometimes, the person you underestimate the most turns out to be exactly the wrong person to mess with. I set the fine down on my kitchen table and looked out at the peaceful waters of Lake Foxglass. Tomorrow, I'd start my investigation into the Elkhorn Ridge HOA and its new chairman. Tonight, I'd enjoy what might be my last quiet evening before this situation got a whole lot more interesting. Because one thing I'd learned in my years as a police officer was that people like Deborah Langley never stopped at just one power play. She was just getting started, and so was I. The next morning, I did what any good investigator would do. I dug into the details. Reading through the HOA regulations felt like navigating a spider web, and Deborah was the only spider who knew how to weave the traps. Every line was a carefully constructed snare, designed for whoever she decided didn't belong. The vehicle standards rule had been passed just 2 months ago, somehow slipping through without anyone in the community knowing about it. That's red flag number 1 in my book. When regulations get passed in the shadows, someone's usually got something to hide. Here's what really caught my attention. This wasn't some blanket policy applied fairly across Elkhorn Ridge. The regulation specifically targeted certain residential areas. And wouldn't you know it, my section was the only one specifically mentioned. Meanwhile, other parts of the community had completely different standards or no vehicle requirements at all. This wasn't about maintaining community aesthetics. This was surgical precision harassment disguised as official policy. The more I investigated, the clearer Deborah's pattern became. She'd been systematically rewriting our community rules like a dictator revising history. But her masterstroke was hiring what she called community safety officers. 2 men in official-looking vests with Elkhorn Ridge security patches who patrolled the neighborhood with clipboards and radios. To most residents, they looked like legitimate law enforcement. To me, they were clearly just private security guards playing dress-up. But the psychological effect on the community was undeniable. That afternoon, I decided to test my theory about selective enforcement with a little field research. I took a casual walk around the community, paying careful attention to vehicles and properties that should have violated Deborah's precious standards. Sure enough, one of the HOA cops was making his rounds, checking properties with military precision. Except he walked right past Steve Patterson's 2018 pickup truck without even glancing at it. The selective blindness was almost comical. When I casually asked a few neighbors about these new regulations and the security patrol, their responses painted a disturbing picture of a community living in fear. Most gave me nervous glances and hurried responses like, "I don't want any trouble with those security guys," or "Deborah says they're here for our protection." The way people talked about the HOA cops made it clear they thought these were real police officers with actual authority. One elderly woman actually stepped closer and lowered her voice when she saw one of the security guards approaching. Those men in uniforms make me nervous. They walk around like they own the place, writing things down, taking pictures. I don't know what authority they actually have, but I'm not taking any chances. The fear in her voice told me everything about the atmosphere Deborah had created. Betty Johnson was the only person willing to have a real conversation about the situation, and what she told me was enlightening. "Those security guards showed up about a month ago," she said when we happened to meet by the lake. Deborah announced them as community enforcement officers, but never explained who hired them or what their actual legal authority is. They've been intimidating residents into compliance by acting like police officers, but I'm pretty sure they're just private security. Betty's concerns weren't just about procedure, they were about the militarization of our peaceful community. "We used to be neighbors who helped each other out," she continued. "Now we have men in pseudo-police uniforms patrolling our streets, and everyone's afraid to do anything without checking with Deborah first. It feels like living in a police state, except the police aren't even real." That evening, as if to prove my point about escalation, I found another notice from the HOA waiting on my door. This one delivered personally by one of the community safety officers. Apparently, my cabin was now guilty of lacking appropriate decorative landscaping, my paint was insufficient in freshness and appeal, and my fence was not properly aligned with community standards. The uniformed man had handed me the citation like he was issuing a real police ticket, complete with official-sounding language about enforcement protocols. I stood there reading this ridiculous list of invented violations while watching the fake cop walk away and felt something shift inside me. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, an actual police chief, being intimidated by someone playing dress-up cop. Each new accusation was more absurd than the last, but the psychological warfare was effective. Having uniformed figures deliver citations made the whole process feel more official and threatening than simple HOA letters. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. While I was being cited for imaginary violations by Deborah's private army, Steve Patterson's clearly non-compliant pickup sat unbothered. The HOA cops walked past genuine violations daily, while targeting me specifically. The selective enforcement wasn't even subtle anymore. It was theater designed to intimidate and humiliate. As I watched the lights come on in cabins around Lake Foxglass that evening, I found myself wondering how many other residents were being intimidated by this fake law enforcement charade. How many were paying fines simply because someone in a uniform told them to. Deborah had created her own little police state, complete with security theater and manufactured authority. I'd spent my entire career dealing with people who thought their position gave them the right to abuse others, but this was a new one. Someone creating fake police to enforce fake rules for personal vendettas. The difference was that usually I could flash my badge and end the situation immediately. This time, I was going to have to be more creative. But that was fine with me. Sometimes the most satisfying victories come from exposing frauds rather than simply overpowering them. The peaceful waters of Lake Foxglass reflected the evening stars just as they had for all 10 years I'd lived here, but everything else was changing rapidly. Deborah Langley thought she'd found an easy target in the quiet guy with a modest cabin and older car. What she'd actually found was someone who understood real law enforcement better than her fake cops ever would. Someone who knew the difference between legitimate authority and security theater, and someone who wasn't going to let a neighborhood tyrant destroy the community he loved with her pretend police force. I decided it was time to play by Deborah's rules, or rather, to expose how she wasn't playing by any rules at all. My first move was to start documenting everything systematically. As someone who'd spent years building legal cases, I knew that evidence was everything, and Deborah's fake police force was about to provide me with plenty of it. I set up a simple security camera system around my property, completely legal since it only covered my own land, and made sure there were clear signs posted about video recording. My research into Deborah's background proved even more interesting than I'd expected. Through some careful investigation and a few calls to colleagues in other jurisdictions, I learned that this wasn't her first time playing with private security. At her previous community, Summerwind Resort, she'd hired property protection officers who'd harassed residents until multiple complaints forced their removal. The security company she'd used there was the same one now providing our HOA cops. This was a tested playbook, not improvisation. The pattern was crystal clear. Deborah moved into established communities, seized control of the HOA, then hired intimidating security guards to enforce her personal vision through fear. The uniforms and official-sounding titles made residents think they were dealing with real law enforcement when they were actually just private contractors with no more authority than any other citizen. But Deborah wasn't content to let me research her activities in peace. 3 days after my second round of fines, I discovered her most audacious move yet. I woke up to find one of the HOA cops supervising the installation of a metal barrier completely blocking my driveway. "Sir, this driveway has been deemed unsafe per community enforcement protocols," the uniformed man announced as I approached with my fishing gear. "Access is restricted pending compliance verification." The sheer audacity took my breath away. Here was a private security guard, dressed to look like a police officer, blocking access to my own property while using official-sounding language that meant absolutely nothing. According to the notice attached to the barrier, my driveway failed to meet safety and aesthetic standards and needed compliance verification before access restoration. It was all theater, but effective theater. This meant I couldn't drive my Honda to my own front door. Instead, I had to park on the main road and walk nearly 200 yards to my cabin. I carried my fishing equipment and groceries like a prisoner returning to his cell, while one of the community safety officers watched from his patrol route, clipboard in hand. The psychological warfare was crystal clear. By making my punishment so visible and having uniformed figures oversee it, Deborah was messaging everyone about what happened when you crossed her private police force. One morning, my elderly neighbor actually nodded hello to me during one of these walks, the first time in weeks anyone had acknowledged me. "I see everything that's happening," he whispered as the HOA security guard passed. "But those men in uniforms, I'm scared of them. They act like real police, but something doesn't feel right." His honesty was more valuable than sympathy. At least someone was seeing through the security theater. Here's what Deborah didn't understand about me. Having fake cops intimidate me was actually hilarious rather than frightening. As an actual police chief, I could see through their act immediately. The wrong equipment, improper procedures, and complete lack of real authority. Instead of intimidating me into compliance, her escalation had the opposite effect. She'd just provided perfect evidence of harassment using unlawful impersonation of law enforcement. The camera footage was better than I could have hoped for. It captured every second of the HOA cop directing barrier placement, while spouting official-sounding nonsense about enforcement protocols. There was the fake uniform, the made-up authority, the illegal blocking of private property, everything I needed to expose this entire charade. This wasn't someone acting on legitimate authority. This was someone using costume police to harass residents. Every day after that, I repeated the same walk past the barrier, while one of Deborah's security guards monitored the situation. Each encounter with the fake cops only strengthened my resolve. They'd nod officiously and make notes on their clipboards, playing their roles as community enforcers while having zero actual authority to enforce anything. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, an actual police chief, being harassed by people playing dress-up cop who thought their uniforms gave them real power. But patience is crucial in real police work, and I'd learned that sometimes the best strategy is letting frauds expose themselves completely before making your move. Deborah's private army was clearly convinced they'd found the perfect way to intimidate residents, and I was curious to see just how far they'd push their fake authority. As I sat in my cabin that night, watching my Honda sitting on the main road, while one of the HOA cops made his evening patrol, I felt anticipation building. Deborah Langley thought she was playing security theater with an intimidated civilian. What she didn't know was that she was actually running a fake police operation against someone who understood real law enforcement better than her hired actors ever would. The security camera footage of the HOA cops blocking my driveway was comedy gold. It clearly showed these pseudo-police officers orchestrating the barrier placement while spouting made-up enforcement jargon that would make any real cop laugh. The satisfaction on their faces as they played their authority roles was unmistakable. This wasn't legitimate security work. This was civilians enjoying the power trip of wearing uniforms and intimidating neighbors. The real breakthrough came when Betty Johnson reached out privately. She'd been feeling increasingly uncomfortable with what was happening, and my situation had pushed her to act. "I can't keep quiet anymore," she told me when we met at a coffee shop in town. "Those security guards aren't real police, are they? They keep talking about enforcement protocols and community compliance standards. But it all sounds made up. Deborah hired them without board approval and won't tell us what company they're from or what authority they actually have." Betty's information was invaluable. She confirmed that the community safety officers had no legitimate law enforcement authority and were operating under completely fabricated procedures. They walk around with radios and clipboards, taking photos of properties and writing citations that look official, but it's all theater, she explained. Deborah's created her own private police force to intimidate residents into compliance, but none of it has any legal backing. The situation escalated when Deborah decided to bring real law enforcement into her vendetta. After weeks of having her fake cops harass me, she called the actual police and filed a complaint, claiming I was harassing and threatening her security personnel. The irony was perfect. She was using my own profession as a weapon while simultaneously running a fake police operation, completely unaware of who I actually was. When a young officer arrived at my cabin to investigate Deborah's complaint, I had to make a quick decision about how to handle the situation. The real cop looked genuinely confused as he explained the allegations. "Ma'am says you've been intimidating her security officers and disrupting their community enforcement duties," he said, clearly puzzled by the whole setup. "To be honest, sir, something about this whole situation seems off to me." I chose not to reveal my identity. When he asked for my name, I simply said, "Robert Miller, I work nearby." The young patrolman seemed even more puzzled by my calm demeanor and the way I spoke about the security officers. There was something about my responses that struck him as unusual for someone supposedly intimidating fake cops. He kept looking at me like he was trying to figure out why I seemed so familiar with proper police procedures. Deborah's complaint involving real police actually worked in my favor multiple ways. First, it created an official record of her false accusations against someone she was harassing with fake law enforcement. Second, it showed she was willing to waste actual police resources to protect her security theater. Third, it demonstrated that her fake cops had no real authority. If they did, why would she need to call real police? The breakthrough I'd been waiting for came through an unexpected source. Paul Henderson, a neighbor I'd barely spoken to in 10 years, quietly approached me while one of the HOA cops was patrolling nearby. "Those aren't real police officers, are they?" he whispered, glancing nervously at the uniformed figure. "My son's a sheriff's deputy, and he says something's not right about their equipment and procedures. Don't give up fighting this. Someone needs to expose what's really happening here." That evening, I received a phone call that changed everything. The voice on the other end was shaky but determined. "Chief Miller, this is Sarah Martinez. I live over on Pine Street. I can't take this anymore. One of those security guards came to my door yesterday, flashing some kind of badge and demanding to inspect my property for violations. When I asked to see his credentials, he got aggressive and said I was obstructing community enforcement." Sarah's voice broke slightly. "These aren't real cops, are they? Because if they were, they'd have real badges and follow proper procedures." Sarah's call confirmed what I already suspected. Deborah's fake police were crossing lines that would get real officers fired. "The man in the uniform told me that failure to comply with community enforcement could result in escalated intervention," Sarah continued. "When I asked what that meant, he just smiled and walked away. I'm scared they're going to do to me what they did to you. Block my driveway, harass my family, make my life miserable." What struck me most about Sarah's call was how the fake cops were emboldening themselves. They were using intimidation tactics that real police would never employ, hiding behind uniforms and manufactured authority to threaten residents. "He took photos of my house without permission and wrote something on his clipboard," Sarah said. "When I told him he couldn't do that, he said, 'Community enforcement has broad discretionary powers.' That's not how real police talk, is it?" The pieces were falling into place perfectly. I had documentation of fake law enforcement officers blocking driveways, intimidating residents, conducting unauthorized property inspections, and making threats under color of authority. More importantly, I had witnesses willing to testify about how Deborah's private army was systematically terrorizing the community while impersonating legitimate law enforcement. Sitting in my cabin that evening, watching my Honda Civic behind the barrier while one of the HOA cops made his evening patrol with his fake radio and clipboard, I realized the full scope of what Deborah had created. This wasn't just harassment. This was a systematic fraud involving impersonation of law enforcement officers. And that was exactly the kind of crime I'd sworn an oath to stop, whether wearing a uniform or not. The time had come to stop playing defense and start mounting serious offense. I spent the next week crafting my strategy, reaching out to targeted residents, and preparing for what I knew would be the final confrontation. My years in law enforcement had taught me that bullies like Deborah usually defeated themselves if you gave them enough rope. And she was about to hang herself with it in the most public way possible. My first move was requesting a special HOA meeting where I could address the community directly. According to bylaws that Deborah supposedly cared about following, any resident had the right to request such a meeting and speak for up to 15 minutes before votes. I submitted my formal request through proper channels, citing my right to address ongoing concerns about rule enforcement and community standards. Deborah couldn't refuse without violating the very procedures she claimed to protect. Deborah's response exceeded my hopes. Instead of trying to delay or deflect, she decided to turn my request into her own grand finale. She sent out a formal invitation that read like a war declaration, complete with official letterhead and dramatic language about addressing serious violations that threaten our community standards. She forgot that half her audience consisted of people she'd personally threatened or harassed. The location was perfect for her purposes. The community clubhouse overlooking Lake Foxglass, with large windows and an elevated platform that would make her presentation feel like a formal legal proceeding. She arranged for projection equipment to display visual evidence of my violations. But what Deborah didn't know was that I'd been hoping she'd do exactly this. Public forums have a way of exposing truth, and I was betting that once neighbors heard both sides, they'd see through her carefully constructed narrative. In the days leading up to the meeting, Deborah's confidence was almost comical. She told anyone who would listen that she'd finally found a way to deal with the Miller problem, and that after the meeting, standards would be restored to Elkhorn Ridge. Steve Patterson was equally cocky, chewing gum like he was watching a football game, completely oblivious that his final play was about to backfire spectacularly. Meanwhile, I was quietly building my coalition. Sarah Martinez had agreed to speak if necessary, despite her fears. Betty Johnson had decided she couldn't remain silent and was prepared to publicly oppose Deborah's abuse of power. Even Paul Henderson, who'd been too scared to speak openly, had promised to attend and show support. The fear and intimidation Deborah thought was keeping everyone in line was actually creating resentment waiting for the right moment to surface. I prepared my presentation carefully, but not how Deborah expected. While she focused on visual displays and dramatic accusations, I organized documentary evidence, legal precedents, and clear factual arguments. I had security camera footage, correspondence records, documentation of selective rule enforcement, and witness testimony. More importantly, I had evidence of actual legal violations, including criminal acts of blocking my private driveway without lawful authority. The evening of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed with more residents than had ever attended an HOA function. Over 30 people showed up, drawn by curiosity about the conflict that had been simmering for weeks. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Everyone knew they were about to witness some kind of showdown, but most had no idea how dramatic it would actually be. Deborah arrived early in a crisp white blazer, testing the microphone and arranging presentation materials behind the podium, like a prosecutor preparing closing arguments. She clearly saw this as her moment of triumph, when she would definitively establish her authority over Elkhorn Ridge and make an example of anyone who dared challenge her vision for the community. Steve sat in the front row, his gum chewing growing more nervous as the room filled up. I arrived quietly and took a seat in the middle of the audience, carrying only a small folder with my documentation. Some neighbors nodded sympathetically. They'd all witnessed my daily walks from the main road where my car was forced to park. Others looked curious about what I might say in my defense. A few seemed embarrassed to make eye contact, probably feeling guilty about not speaking up about obviously unfair treatment. Sarah Martinez was there too, sitting near the back with her husband, both looking nervous but determined. Paul Henderson had claimed a seat near the side wall, giving me a subtle thumbs up when our eyes met. Betty Johnson sat with the other board members, but kept glancing my way with obvious anticipation. The community members who'd been intimidated into silence were finally ready to have their voices heard. As 7 o'clock approached and Deborah called the meeting to order, I felt familiar calm settling over me. It was the same feeling I got before walking into a courtroom to testify or confronting a suspect with evidence of their crimes. This was when all the preparation, documentation, and patience would pay off. Deborah thought she was about to deliver the final blow in our conflict, but what was actually about to happen was a masterclass in how justice works when someone finally decides to stand up to a bully. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was Deborah, standing under bright clubhouse lights with Lake Foxglass shimmering in the background, completely confident she was about to achieve total victory over the quiet man with the old Honda who dared challenge her authority. Steve's gum had stopped moving entirely as he realized the room wasn't filled with the supportive audience they had expected. She had no idea she was actually about to face someone whose entire career was built on exposing people who abused power, someone who understood law better than she did, and someone who'd been building a case against her from day one. As Deborah began her presentation with obvious relish, I sat back and prepared to watch her destroy herself with her own words. The clubhouse was absolutely silent as Deborah launched into her presentation, and I had to admit, she'd prepared quite a show. She'd arranged professional-looking slides displaying photos of my cabin, my Honda Civic, and even aerial shots of the entire Elkhorn Ridge community, with my property circled in red, like some kind of infection that needed to be removed. Her confidence was absolutely radiating from the podium as she clicked through her evidence, building what she clearly believed was an unassailable case for why I needed to be removed from the community. "Ladies and gentlemen," Deborah began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never doubted her own righteousness. "We're here tonight to address a serious threat to our community's standards and property values. For months, I've tried to work reasonably with Mr. Miller to bring his property into compliance with our established regulations. Unfortunately, he has chosen to respond with defiance, harassment, and threats. She paused dramatically, letting that accusation hang in the air while she advanced to her next slide, a photo of the metal barrier blocking my driveway. The situation became so severe, she continued, that I was forced to take protective action to ensure community safety. Mr. Miller's driveway was deemed unsafe and aesthetically inappropriate, requiring immediate closure until proper corrections could be made. Despite this reasonable accommodation, he has continued his pattern of intimidation and attempts to undermine legitimate community governance. The way she said it, you'd think I was some kind of dangerous criminal rather than a guy who just wanted to park in his own driveway and live peacefully in his cabin. Deborah spent nearly 20 minutes detailing my alleged violations, describing my Honda Civic as a vehicle that fails to meet basic community standards, my cabin as aesthetically inconsistent with resort-quality housing, and my behavior as deliberately disruptive to community harmony. She presented herself as a dedicated public servant who'd been forced to make difficult decisions to protect property values and community standards. By the time she finished, she'd painted a picture of herself as the victim and me as some kind of neighborhood menace who needed to be dealt with decisively. When she called for an immediate vote to permanently remove the Miller property from Elkhorn Ridge community membership, I could see several residents nodding along with her presentation. Fear and confusion were powerful tools, and Deborah had wielded them expertly. But as she opened the floor for discussion before the vote, something interesting happened. Betty Johnson stood up first, and instead of supporting Deborah's motion, she began asking pointed questions about proper procedures, community notification requirements, and the legal authority to block private driveways. That's when I requested my 15 minutes to respond, as was my right under HOA procedures. Deborah couldn't refuse without violating her own rules, but I could see the irritation flash across her face as she realized I wasn't going to simply accept my fate quietly. "Very well," she said with barely concealed contempt. "Mr. Miller may have his say before we proceed with the vote, though I hope everyone will remember that actions speak louder than words, and his actions have been consistently disruptive to our community." I walked calmly to the podium, set down my folder, and began with a simple statement. I've lived in this community for 10 years, since before there was an HOA, since before most of you even knew Elkhorn Ridge existed. In all that time, I've never had to climb over barriers just to get to my own front door. The room was absolutely silent as I continued. But for the past several weeks, that's exactly what I've had to do, because someone decided that my private driveway could be blocked without legal authority, proper procedures, or community approval. I opened my folder and began presenting the evidence I'd been gathering, documentation showing that Deborah's regulations had been implemented without proper votes, security camera footage of her personally supervising the illegal blocking of my driveway, and testimonies from other residents who'd been similarly harassed. With each piece of evidence, I could see the mood in the room beginning to shift. People were starting to realize that what they'd been told was reasonable rule enforcement was actually a systematic campaign of harassment and intimidation. The most important thing you need to understand, I continued, looking directly at Deborah, is that blocking someone's private driveway without legal authority isn't just a violation of HOA procedures. It's actually a criminal offense under state law, and it's all been documented. Deborah's face went pale as I said this, and I could see Steve Patterson shifting uncomfortably in his seat. They were beginning to realize that their little power game might have real legal consequences. But Deborah wasn't going down without a fight. She interrupted my presentation, claiming that I was making false accusations and attempting to intimidate community leadership. Her voice was rising as she spoke, and the calm authority she'd displayed earlier was beginning to crack. "This is exactly the kind of disruptive behavior we cannot tolerate in our community," she declared. "Mr. Miller is clearly trying to use lies and threats to avoid taking responsibility for his violations." That's when she made her fatal mistake. In her desperation to regain control of the situation, Deborah played what she thought was her trump card. "If Mr. Miller continues with these accusations and this disruptive behavior," she announced dramatically, "I will have no choice but to call the police and have him removed from this meeting for threatening and harassing community leadership. I will call the police right now if necessary." The room fell completely silent. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the perfect setup that I couldn't have planned better if I'd tried. I smiled calmly and said, "You don't need to call anyone, Deborah. I'm already here." Then I reached into my wallet, pulled out my police chief badge, and held it up for everyone in the room to see. "Chief Robert Miller, Millbrook Police Department." The reaction was instantaneous and electric. I watched as 30 faces transformed in unison, mouths dropping open, eyes widening in shock, some people actually rising from their chairs to get a better look at my badge. An elderly woman in the front row gasped audibly and pressed her hand to her chest. A man near the back let out a low whistle of amazement. The teenager who'd been dragged along by her parents suddenly perked up and whispered, "Holy crap," before her mother shushed her. Steve Patterson's coffee cup slipped from his hands and clattered to the floor, spilling across the polished wood. But the most dramatic reaction was Deborah herself. The woman who'd been so confident and authoritative just moments before now looked like she'd seen a ghost. Her face went from pale to absolutely ashen. Her mouth opened and closed several times without any sound coming out, and her hands began visibly shaking as she gripped the edges of the podium. For the first time since I'd known her, Deborah Langley was completely speechless. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before it was broken by Betty Johnson, who stood up and began clapping slowly. "Chief Miller," she said loudly, "I think I speak for everyone here when I say we owe you an apology." Her words seemed to break the spell, and suddenly other residents were standing as well. One by one, voices began joining in. "We're sorry, Chief. We should have spoken up sooner. Thank you for your patience with all of this." An older gentleman I recognized but had never spoken to stood up near the back. "Chief, I want to personally apologize," he called out. "I knew what she was doing to you wasn't right, but I was too much of a coward to say anything. That barrier blocking your driveway was an absolute disgrace, and every one of us who walked past it without speaking up should be ashamed." Heads nodded throughout the room, and I could see genuine remorse and anger beginning to replace the shock on people's faces. "For the past several weeks," I continued, my voice still completely calm, "I've watched someone abuse a position of authority to harass and intimidate residents of this community. I've documented criminal behavior, procedural violations, and systematic harassment. I chose not to use my position to end this situation quickly because I wanted to see just how far it would go, and because I believe in letting the system work properly when possible." Deborah tried to speak, but no words came out. The woman who'd been so confident and authoritative just minutes before was now completely speechless, staring at my badge like it was evidence of her own doom, which, in a way, it was. The entire room was buzzing with whispered conversations as residents processed what they'd just learned and began to understand the full implications of what had been happening in their community. "I said it before, and I'll say it again," I concluded, looking directly at Deborah. "I was just being quiet to see how far you'd go. Turns out you went far enough to dig your own grave." The aftermath of my revelation was swift and decisive. The room that had been silent with shock just moments before erupted in animated conversations as residents processed what they'd just learned. Some were expressing outrage at how Deborah had manipulated and deceived them. Others were asking questions about the legality of her actions. And quite a few were apologizing to me for not speaking up sooner when they knew something wasn't right. The power dynamic in our community had shifted completely in the span of a single moment. Deborah's attempts to recover from the situation only made things worse for her. She tried to claim that my position as police chief somehow invalidated her concerns about community standards, but that argument fell flat when residents realized that I'd never used my authority inappropriately. I'd simply endured her harassment like any other citizen would have to do. She then tried to suggest that I should have identified myself from the beginning, but Betty Johnson quickly pointed out that there was no requirement for residents to disclose their professions to the HOA, and that Deborah's behavior would have been just as wrong regardless of who her victim was. The vote that followed was overwhelmingly decisive. Instead of voting to remove me from the community, as Deborah had intended, the residents voted unanimously to remove both Deborah and Steve Patterson from the HOA board immediately. There were calls for investigations into their abuse of authority, demands for the immediate removal of the barrier blocking my driveway, and general consensus that the entire HOA needed to be restructured with proper oversight and accountability measures. Betty Johnson was elected as the new chairwoman of the HOA, and her first official act was to declare that all of Deborah's unilateral regulations were null and void, pending proper community discussion and voting. The vehicle standards, the aesthetic requirements, the landscaping mandates, all of it was swept away in a single motion that passed with enthusiastic support from everyone present. The relief in the room was palpable as residents realized they were free from the arbitrary rules and constant threats that had been hanging over their community. The most satisfying moment came when a work crew arrived at my cabin the very next morning, not to install more barriers, but to remove the metal obstruction that had been blocking my driveway for weeks. I watched from my porch as they dismantled Deborah's monument to petty tyranny, and I'll admit, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction as my path home was finally cleared. Several neighbors stopped by throughout the day to apologize for not speaking up sooner, and to express their relief that the situation had been resolved. Within 2 weeks, both Deborah and Steve had quietly put their properties up for sale and disappeared from Elkhorn Ridge without any goodbyes or explanations. Deborah's massive 2-story cabin, which had been the symbol of her superiority complex, now sat empty with a "for sale" sign that seemed to mock her failed attempt to remake our community in her image. Steve's departure was equally unceremonious. One day his pickup truck was gone, and that was the last anyone saw of him. The transformation in our community's atmosphere was remarkable and immediate. Without the constant threat of arbitrary fines and harassment, residents began actually talking to each other again, instead of walking around in fear of being reported for imaginary violations. Mrs. Henderson started her vegetable garden again, something she'd abandoned when Deborah complained it wasn't aesthetically appropriate. The Johnsons began hosting their weekend barbecues by the lake, inviting neighbors to join them for the first time in months. Children started playing outside again, without their parents worrying about noise complaints or disrupting community tranquility. Property owners started making improvements to their homes because they wanted to, not because they were being forced to comply with someone else's vision of perfection. The Martinellis painted their cabin a cheerful yellow that they'd always wanted, but had been afraid to try under Deborah's regime. Old Mr. Thompson started building the dock he'd been planning for years, but had put off when the HOA began scrutinizing every modification. The community garden that had been neglected during Deborah's reign was restored by a group of enthusiastic volunteers, and neighbors began organizing social events by the lake again. One of the most meaningful changes was the new community sign that replaced Deborah's pretentious Elkhorn Ridge Resort community marker. The new sign read simply, "Foxglass Commons, welcoming all since 1997, reflecting both our community's inclusive values and its real history, rather than Deborah's manufactured narrative about exclusivity and luxury." It was a small change, but it symbolized everything that had been restored to our neighborhood. A week after the infamous HOA meeting, I received a package in the mail from some residents of Summerwind Resort, Deborah's previous community. Along with a thank you card, they'd included newspaper clippings about the controversies she'd caused there, and a letter expressing their gratitude that someone finally knew how to handle her properly. It turned out that word of what had happened at Elkhorn Ridge had reached them, and they wanted me to know how many people had been helped by my willingness to stand up to her systematic bullying. The legal consequences for Deborah's actions were handled quietly, but thoroughly. The documented evidence of her illegally blocking my driveway, filing false police reports, and violating numerous procedural requirements provided more than enough grounds for both civil and criminal charges. However, her rapid departure from the community and agreement to make full restitution for damages made a lengthy legal battle unnecessary. Sometimes justice is served more effectively through exposure and consequences than through prolonged court proceedings. As summer turned to fall around Lake Foxglass, I found myself reflecting on the lessons learned from this experience. The most important one was that bullies rely on good people staying quiet and hoping someone else will solve the problem. Deborah's reign of terror over our community was only possible because too many residents were afraid to speak up, either out of fear of retaliation or hope that the situation would resolve itself. It took someone willing to document her behavior systematically and confront her publicly to end the harassment. I also learned something profound about what really matters in life. I don't need a mansion or a luxury car to be happy. I don't need to impress anyone with expensive possessions or conform to someone else's idea of success. What I need is simple: peace, good neighbors, and a driveway that leads to my own front door without anyone having the power to block it. I need the freedom to live according to my own values, not someone else's vision of what my life should look like. Sitting on my cabin porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over Lake Foxglass with my Honda Civic parked exactly where it belongs, I realized that this simple life was worth fighting for. On quiet evenings now, I sit on my cabin porch and watch the sun set over Lake Foxglass with my Honda Civic parked right where it belongs in my own driveway. The peace that Deborah tried to destroy has been restored to our community. But it's stronger now because we've all learned the importance of standing up for what's right. Neighbors wave when they drive by, kids play by the lake without fear of being cited for noise violations. And the community that I fell in love with 10 years ago is back to being the kind of place where people actually want to live. The most important lesson from this whole experience is simple. Sometimes the person who seems powerless turns out to be exactly the right person to restore justice. Deborah thought she'd found an easy target in the quiet guy with the old car and simple cabin. What she actually found was someone who understood that real strength comes not from the ability to intimidate others, but from the courage to stand up when intimidation needs to be stopped.